Hello, everyone. This is Ed Breniger, and welcome to the Eddie Network podcast. My guest today is Kevin LaTorre, and my introduction to him was watching him do a presentation at a writers' conference sort of thingy several weeks ago, where there were poets and essayists, and it was a fascinating thing, and almost everybody was young, so which was really cool. So welcome, Kevin, and uh, tell us a little bit about yourself, and particularly tell us a little bit about what your whole writing gig is all about.
Yeah. Well, thank you, first of all, for having me on. It's kind of fun. Also, I like how serendipitous it was just to meet you at that event, which was it's an Ekstasis magazine Inkwell evening, I think is what they're called.
Yeah.
So they've been doing them around the US. I think they had one or two overseas, I think in London the last couple of years. So Ekstasis is this magazine um, put up by Christianity Today. So they bring in musicians, poets like me, and then essayists. And I had the pleasure of attending one in Charlotte, where Ed and I both were. And then the year previous, I'd had the chance to read at one that they did in Durham at the Duke University Divinity School. So that kind of will begin to lead into an introduction to me. But Ed, first, I did want to point out, not to tease you a little on your own show, but you came up to me after and you told me you didn't quite know how to get into poetry, and I think that's an interesting place to start.
Yeah.
Because I did read some poems, and that is a common experience of poetry. Um, I did not really start reading poetry until I was in college. I kind of took the inverse way of writing versus reading poetry, is that I started writing it before I'd really read any, which is a bad way to do it. Just because, I mean, something I had mentioned from the kind of into the microphone during the event was that writing is essentially just really, really, really intensive reading. Reading is the first form of writing. And so for me to begin writing anything before I'd really taken in a sense of what has been done, particularly in poetry, I didn't know it at the time. That was silly of me. So I'm continuing to read back and continuing to try to make up that difference. So yeah, and in terms of
Can I ask you a
general,
question about that?
yeah, please.
Have you written prose?
I have.
Okay,
So actually, it's funny. Sorry.
so prose and poetry, the syntax is different, isn't it?
Oh, big time. Hmm.
Can you articulate what that difference is?
Oh boy.
That would help. That would be really helpful to me.
Yeah, yeah. I think. Well, as many poets as you ask this question, if you ask a poet what is poetry, you will get a different answer for every poet that you ask. So infinite answers, infinite poets. I think the best definition I have liked in terms of one that appreciates the way poetry works and the history of poetry through time is that poetry is patterned sound or patterned language. So you can talk about meter, you can talk about rhyme, you can talk about the number of syllables, you can talk about emphasis or stress points within a line of poetry.
Yeah.
So I think those sort of patterns are what I would say differentiates poetry from prose. Now, I mean, you have patterns according to sort of general syntax of writing out a sentence and then forming that sentence with another sentence into um, paragraphs, and then paragraphs into maybe sections, and sections into, for instance, if it's a persuasive essay, you have paragraphs that form sections, which then form parts of your argument, which then support your thesis. So there is some structure there. So there is a pattern there. But I think what poetry does that prose usually doesn't is that at the level of not even the sentence, but even smaller than the sentence is the line of poetry, you can have fairly strict or very fairly consistent patterns. So, and if you're learning, which I actually have been learning more formal poetry as I go, it kind of can be tricky because you learn, it almost feels like you're doing math. You're doing math with language, particularly if you're trying to do iambic pentameter or other formal poetry. You're counting syllables, you are measuring the number of lines, you're working backwards from the number of syllables and the number of lines in order to fit your meaning within a kind of pre-existing pattern, which feels a lot like Tetris. It feels a lot like math. It feels a lot less the sort of passionate romantic poet image that we usually like to think about with poetry, where it's all just, like it's emotion, it's sheer feeling, it is great expression of the heart. And it's interesting because the poets, we usually think of the English romantics when we think about that image. All of those guys, or many of them, perfected formal poetry. So they were still writing in meter, they were still writing in rhyme. And so this sense that poetry should be free to express has always kind of had a little bit of a, I guess it was a little circumscribed. There was a certain sort of structure for it to do that. So anyway, that is the long answer as
Well,
to the difference in my mind between poetry and prose.
okay. So when I said to you at the event that I didn't really know how to get into poetry, what I'm not able to get into is the kind of poetry where they're complete sentences like in prose that that get sectioned into separate lines, if you know what I mean. The kind of poetry that I've read in the past that I actually enjoyed was had no kind of form of a sentence at all. I mean, there would be it would be more collections of phrases or even just one word, and it's a lot more impressionistic. It would be the way I would say it, and
Interesting.
and um, and I can't give you anyone off the top of my head because this has been a long time, but that sort of highly chaotic kind of language, of
Hmm.
words, um, is it's like let me give you an example of what I mean. It's like if I'm walking down the beach and I'm throwing sand, shells, waves, sunset, and a dog all into something that I'm seeing. I'm experiencing all of those things, and somehow
Yep.
I'm putting all those together into some kind of sequence of words which give a almost an emotional impression of the moment that I'm in.
Mhm.
That's the kind of stuff that I have actually found interesting.
Okay.
That makes sense to you?
It does. I know exactly what you mean. Yeah.
Free
I was
verse, I guess,
thinking,
is the way of saying it.
no, no, I think that's an extreme, I think that's a helpful way of saying it because that's the way I mean, that's a pretty apt description of a good poem is the way that it's the way that it encapsulate or it's the way that it creates but also sort of enacts an experience. So when you were describing that, I was actually thinking of modernist literature because I don't know how familiar you are, and this is a familiar bugbear when I talk to people about just the things that I was reading that helped me or that continue to form kind of my sense of how writing can work. Is that you had modernists, and we can talk about time period, we can talk about historical trends if you want, but essentially what they did was they took language to such a place that you could sort of give the impression of thought, the impression of sensation, like you're saying, without kind of more conventional syntactical considerations. So you have fragmented sentences. Sometimes there are periods, sometimes there are not. But what it does is that you can combine words, you can combine impressions and fragments of sensation into such a way to really simulate the human mind. So the book I'm thinking of most immediately is Ulysses by James Joyce. There is actually, it's funny you brought up the beach scene because there is a scene of one of the protagonists of the novel, Stephen Dedalus, where he's walking along. It's called the Strand. That's what they call beaches in Ireland, is the Strand. And he's walking along. He has an intake of his sensations that are also kind of colliding, like sort of the collection of items in a kaleidoscope with the thoughts he was already thinking. And so what it does is it gives you the entire impression of a fairly agile mind, one that's really trying to escape the sensation that he can't help but intake, but it's all rendered via prose. And it can be very jarring, but the longer you read it, the more the impression sort of teaches itself to you. Um, I mean, if anyone of your listeners have read the novel, they may remember a fairly famous term, I believe it's the ineluctable modality or the ineluctability of the modality, which, to be honest with you, I'm still not really sure what that means. I mean, that's the other thing. That novel and many other sort of modernist texts are extremely heady. But to me, the sensation of the prose when it's good is really good for that sensation you're describing, where it simulates sensation, it simulates the mind, it simulates experience by pushing language to sort of really past kind of conventional limits. So is that
Yeah.
similar to what you were describing? Okay.
Possibly, possibly. I've not read Ulysses, but yeah, it, what it, what my experience is in the stuff that I've read that I liked was this sense of discovery,
Hmm.
something I'm on opening up, and it's not simply a kind of a left brain rational statement of okay, there's the, I remember in my freshman English class many years ago, we read some poetry, and I'm just trying to pull this out of my memory, so I may not have it right, but I think the poet was Wallace Stevens, and um, I'm not gonna get it, but it was like this poem called "The Red Wheelbarrow" or something. It's
Oh
like
yeah, yeah.
so much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rain beside the white chickens. I think it's something like that.
Something along those lines. A very simple description, right?
And that I don't know what that means, but those of us in the class thought, well, that's really, I don't know, amazing, interesting. And it became something that was as kind of like this little trinket we carry, or a talisman we would carry around as, we would, and every now and then we would just say the poem, because it was
Yeah.
in our memory. And you know
Mm. So okay. So how many poems in this course, if you remember, how many did you memorize?
that was the only one.
Okay.
So I mean, this is English literature, so it's not like, I mean, it's just, it was a very introductory course. um but yeah, it was the fact that I remember that over 50 years later is pretty remarkable.
I'd agree. I'd agree if I didn't think that was one of the things about poetry is it can really lend itself to memorization. And I think once you have memorized a poem, I think it does. In some ways, it sticks with you.
Yeah.
I think that's so. We were talking earlier, or I was talking earlier about um, kind of formal meter. So that sort of iambic pentameter, the two stress beats within every foot. And I think part of the reason that that was taken up is because to create the sort of ba-bum, ba-bum, ba-bum rhythm within a line actually helps you memorize the words. That's one of my working theories, and that's not just my theory. I think that's kind of attested to across all of the use of that form is that building a pattern into a poem helps people remember the poem. You know,
It was like
uh,
learning a song.
yeah, exactly. It is very similar. It is very similar. I think I don't know if you people try to scan poems musically, and it gets fairly difficult because it's not like a one-to-one comparison, but it is a similar concept. That if there is a strong, for instance, if there is a drum beat and then there are lyrics on top of a drum beat in tandem with it, you probably have a sense of what the words are based on the way that you hear the drum in your head. Yeah. So okay, so yeah, okay, you had Wallace Stevens. I'm trying to think of trying to think of some other poets you might have encountered, because one of the first places where I started reading poetry really was I started digging into an American anthology. So there's a lot of Americans from the 20th century. So Wallace Stevens, Denise Levertov, Randall Jarrell, Galway Kinnell. I mean, I was going to say Seamus Heaney, but he was not an American. But anyway, so that you have, okay, so you definitely have found your way into poetry. That's, I guess I had misunderstood when you first brought it up.
Well, just in having this conversation with you, I'm being reminded of a of an exposure to it that actually worked for me. But
Mhm.
I've had a number of poets on the podcast, um, and I like what they're saying, but and I'm not trying to be critical of their poetry because it's theirs, and I
Mhm.
respect what they've done. It's just, um, and it may be the topics they write on that don't. I'm looking. I think maybe my expectations are I'm going to get grabbed by the throat, and I'm going
Mhm.
to be made aware of this thing that the writer is trying to communicate, and I'm going to my life is going to be changed because this thing has grabbed me by the throat or grabbed me by the hair and said, "Pay attention. This is important." And that's what I think. That's what I think about poets is that they're trying to grab our attention so that we're aware of something that is of real significance.
I think so. I think it depends on the poet. So I'm thinking of Allen Ginsberg. I mean, that was the way his poetry worked, was that he was kind of not deranged, but he was like a sort of street preacher, grab you by the scruff, grab you by the lapels, and like you need to hear every one of these words, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I think I appreciate that that's open to poetry. I appreciate the poetry can do that. And I'm also like I can appreciate also that people are not interested in doing that. Like I think it's the nice thing about text, it's the nice thing about literature, it's the nice thing about different forms is that there are different forms for different uses. And so I've 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 never really enjoyed the poems that do that. I think because I prefer actually prose that does that. So I kind of have different hopes for the different forms.
Hmm.
And what you were saying earlier about experiencing something new, or no, I don't think you said experience. I think you said learn, or to like kind of have a sense of like you're receiving something different. That to me has always been like that was what drew me into doing any of this, writing prose, writing poetry. Was that I was lucky to read novels in particular that where the language made me see something I'd already understood in a totally different way, just by the way it was phrased. Whereas like, okay, like this is somehow made new here on the page. It's weird because I know it, but now I didn't realize that it was like this. I didn't know it like this. Um,
So when people read your poetry,
hmm.
do they ever say to you, "I'm hearing your voice, your literal voice, when I'm reading this. This sounds like Kevin."
Oh, that's a great question. Well, for one thing, I don't know how many people are reading my poetry. That's part of the trouble with being a poet. Is the other thing I think? No, I've never had that as a comment. Just because I don't tend to like first person kind of monologue style poems. Actually, I don't know. There's maybe that's just because that's what I began with, and to me, it just feels like it was something I needed to, at least for now, to sort of outgrow until maybe I go back to it later. And so it's rarely I rarely write it to be me speaking. Now that could well change. I'm just thinking about what I've been doing recently. No, I've never heard that. Have you ever told that to a poet?
I've had it told to me.
Okay.
Um, my first book I published in 2018, Circle of Impact. I've had
Mhm.
people say, as I'm reading this, I'm hearing you speak,
Mm, that's
and
good.
I'm thinking there is no greater compliment than you give to an author than I'm hearing your actual voice as I read these words.
Interesting. Okay. Do you think that was something to do with the fact that it was kind of direct address nonfiction?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think it
Yeah.
definitely does.
Yeah.
Yeah. It definitely has that. Um, but you see, I was also intentional in not writing an academic book,
Hmm.
which
Hmm.
would not have that tone of voice,
Hmm. Hmm.
because I wanted something that people wanted to read and that it would be available to anyone who 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 reads. I mean, not just reads. I mean, it reads anything. Reads the newspaper, reads magazines. And that they could pick up the book and they could get in to read it, and it would be accessible to them.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge, I think, of any writer is to make your what you're writing accessible to people that you don't know and they don't know you.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's always the tension and always kind of the lesson is how accessible to make it, where it's like you don't want to be, or correction, you can't make, I don't think you can write in such a way to be entirely accessible to everyone everywhere. I don't think that's, for one thing,
Right.
you're limited by your language. For another thing, that's just, it's difficult. But the other thing is like, you don't want to go to the extreme where no one can find their way in, you know?
Do you have an image in your mind of the ideal reader of your poetry?
That's my wife.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah. Um, because I,
What a
hmm,
that is That's the perfect answer.
thank you.
Because
Thank you.
in that sense, if I may say it this way, this is a very intimate thing to say. In that sense, all your poetry is sort of love poetry to your wife.
Maybe. Yeah.
It's
I
some.
think so. I don't know.
I mean, it's not
Yeah.
romantic. It's not romantic. But if if you're writing for her, which is sounds like that's
Hmm.
what you're trying to do. What a beautiful thing.
Partly. Partly. I think maybe I meant that there was a sense of, or there was a level of intimacy. And also because to your question about who would be able to, like, who would read a poem that I wrote and hear it in my voice, it would be her. And so, yeah, but it's tricky though, because she knows me very well. And so we talk about accessibility. And so there's some part of me that's like, okay, like I can't only write for her. I would hope always that she would enjoy it. That's kind of a different thing though.
Can call you out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, you're not. What are you hiding here? This is not very authentic. What's going on here? It's
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
yeah. And we need those kind of people in our lives.
Oh, big time. Yeah. I mean, I feel like especially if you spend time working with words, working with symbols, working with ideas, you absolutely need someone who's likely more grounded than you are. I've been blessed that is that person is my wife, and that we're together and we can talk frankly and lovingly, of course.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
So when was it, and what was the moment that you said, I'm gonna be a poet?
Oh, mercy.
Because
I don't know.
there may be people watching this who
Yeah.
they're hearing they're hearing our conversation and they think, I wonder if I could be a poet.
Mhm.
And the answer to that is,
I'm not sure what the answer to that is, because I'm like, it's not that no one like. I guess it's an interesting question for me to answer because I never thought, oh, I'm going to be a poet. It was
um,
more like I need to write a poem if that makes me a poet. Like I don't know, like I didn't think about
is
the
poetry a
noun.
vehicle? Is it a vehicle for something else? Is
Yeah,
poetry?
that's how it began. Yeah, that's how it began. Definitely was, I was a teenager and I was 15 or 16, and when you're a teenager, you have great expressive outpourings, um, And for me, I was like, oh, like I can't just write this down in paragraphs. This needs to be more. And that's what I thought poems were for. I think that's something I've at some level kind of outgrown, but it meant that it was like, oh, it wasn't about like, oh, I want to be known, as opposed to like I need to do this. Like I need to do it like this for some reason. And I think that, if you're thinking about like, oh, like, could I be a poet? I'm like, maybe the secondary question of like, can you write a poem? Or like, do you need to write a poem?
So,
Because arguably everybody can write a poem. The question is like how to do it and how to like improve. Uh,
so, so here's the money question. Did you feel
okay.
like you had to go learn how to write a poem, or did you just start writing a poem?
Um, all right, the very I don't know if this is the money answered your money question, but I think it was both. I began writing poems before I realized that I needed to read more in order to write better poetry.
Right. Okay.
I yeah, I think I began writing poems before I knew what a poem was.
That's
Um,
figured.
yeah, yeah, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that because it brought me into it. Like that was what I was able to do and what I was was necessary for me to do at the time. I think if you're interested in writing poetry over a long course of time, I think there are things you can learn about poetry. I think it can be, if you're careful about it, a sort of discipline in your thoughts and in your understanding. Not to say that you need to be a great poetic scholar in order to be a good poet. I just mean that poems have existed for such a long time that to write a poem and not have a sense of what a poem has been before you, to me, that actually risks shortchanging your own poems. Um, so again, that was something I learned well after I'd started because I didn't know.
Well, you were young. You were a young man at the time,
Yeah.
and I mean, you were still emerging as an adult at 15.
Mhm.
You're
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
you in that sense. You remind me of my son Troop, who you've met.
Mhm.
And when he started writing, um, he came to his mother to me and said, "I'd like a computer." I mean, this is the mid '90s, and back then we had one computer in the house, and we didn't have smartphones, and we just had flip phones. This is the dark ages, the technological dark ages. And so
Yeah.
we found him a used computer, and he started writing. He had ideas about what he wanted to write about, stories, and he'd work 2 or 3 hours a day writing, and he wrote over a course of 2 years. He wrote an alternative history of Second World War.
Hmm.
The alternative history is that Hitler was taken out by a political coup before the war, and Stalin becomes the focal point of the war. And the question is, well, the realization is that until Stalin is taken out, the war will continue. So there were non-assassination attempts on Stalin, and it's called the Nine Lives of Comrade Stalin. And he did it primarily so he could learn how to write battle scenes and write dialogue.
Okay. And then, so, I mean, was he like kind of self-consciously doing it as an exercise, or was he hoping that this would be kind of, this would be the first kind of novel?
He's very self-conscious in learning how. I mean, he started this at 11, 12 years old.
There you go. Okay.
So this is, I mean, the expect, and I took the first three chapters of this thing, and I sent it out to some agents and a couple of publishers, and they said, well, I mean, he's got promise, but
Great. Yeah.
got promise at the age of 14, and so they're not gonna at that point. I mean, we're talking now 20 years ago, or
Yeah.
yeah, 20 years ago. Is that right? No, we're talking
Maybe 30. Yeah.
25 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting thing to look at how young young people. I mean, I'm putting you in that category because we're definitely older than you, but young people decide they're going to be creative in the way they
Hmm.
are going to approach their life.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question I would have for Troop is about his kind of examples, because I can definitely draw examples. My mom was a writer. She was kind of a hobbyist about it, not too, again, she was not very concerned, like, oh, like, am I going to be a writer or a person who writes books? She was more just like, oh, I just got to do this thing. And so she blogged and kept other stuff, and she would kind of make books that were only, there's only one or two copies, and they were both like in our house and maybe in like her in her parents' house. And that was something that she was able to create that she gave to us. And but in doing that, she definitely was writing. And so I had a sense of like, oh, like that's just something you could do. So I guess like definitely there are usually examples going out before young people if they're observing and deciding like, oh, like this is something one can do with their time, if not with their whole life. Um, so I imagine Troop had his examples.
Yeah, he had read a lot of history, a lot of Southern history, a lot of Civil War history, a lot of military history.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, a lot. I mean, in fifth grade, he was reading adult level history. And so he was forming in his own mind how he wanted to approach this. And he's done well with that.
That's great. Yeah, yes. That's also just it's a great title.
Well, it's it's something that I think young people need encouragement. They
Mm.
need someone to say to them, uh, keep going. You got something here. I'll give you an example, a current one. I joined the choir at my church last fall.
Mm.
We never sung in a choir, never sung. I mean, this is sophisticated. Sometimes we're singing six part pieces. And there's a one of the families in the church has a couple of people in the choir, and a little over a month ago, 6 weeks ago, this young woman joined the choir, and she's the daughter of one of the couples in the church, and the granddaughter of a guy that I grew up with, and she's only 15 years old, and she's joined the choir. And I went up to her and I told her, I said, I think this is wonderful that you've done this. It contributes so much to us, but even more so, the fact that you feel the courage to step forward and join an adult choir rather than just singing in the youth choir, it says a lot about who you are, and it says a lot about your parents and their encouragement of you.
Mm.
And
I'm glad you encouraged her. That's I don't know. Also, I just appreciate that she's sounds like she's fully at home in the church, which is that's great.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So did she join around the same time you did?
No, no, I joined back in September, and she
Okay.
just joined, February,
Okay.
January.
Gotcha. Who
And
knows? Maybe you were the example that inspired
no, I didn't know her before then. Her father had been in the choir, and he's come back to the choir.
her.
Her
Okay.
grandmother's in the choir, her grandfather's in the choir. Her mother, her aunt, her aunt, not her mother, but her aunt's in the choir. I mean, there's a lot of this family in the choir. It's a
I
large,
love it.
it's, 25, 30
Sounds-
people. So
Yeah, I mean, and it also sounds like a fairly large family to have like, maybe going on a fifth or the sixth of that choir.
yeah, yeah. But to me, the encouragement of young people by older people to do things which are creative and test their capacity to learn and to do things that um, maybe in some families they would not be expected to do that because well we don't want them to fail because it may be traumatic for them if they fail. Well, uh,
Yeah. Or I mean, I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but like I've known people um, who were it was tricky for them to pursue creative things because it was understood or it was believed that like their parents thought that such pursuits would be frivolous. They would be a poor use of time, or they would require money that the family didn't have, or they would be like it would be kind of a question of like why would you spend your time doing that? Doesn't necessarily advance XYZ, which Yeah, that's a hard, and the people I've known, that was a hard thing on them in terms of like adding a kind of unpleasant pressure to what they were trying to enjoy, was to prove that it was worthwhile.
Our attitude was, you can go try anything you want because you don't know until you tried it. And if
Yeah,
it's something for you, okay, we'll try something else. We'll continue to try. Try, fail a lot, try, fail. It's the only way you learn.
yeah, like that. Yeah, I think it's not. Yeah, it's pretty well open ended in a way that, I mean, just helps
You,
people
so you don't
test it.
write with a pen, you write with a pencil and an eraser, right?
No, I do write with a pen actually. I just cross out a bunch. Uh,
So that's kind of the legend of writers is that they write with an eraser always.
I think so. It's funny. I write with a pen and I revise with a pencil. So I don't know why. There's something about the two different colors on the page that helps me when I'm revising. You can't edit it.
So when you finished a poem, allegedly you've finished a poem.
Yeah, sometimes. Yeah.
Uh, how many revisions have you gone through typically?
It's at least four.
Uh-huh.
So four new versions. Yeah, I mean, it kind of depends. Kind of depends on the poem, and how much time I have to do it. There's sometimes like, I don't know, sometimes I feel like I have more time with it. Other times I feel like I have less, but yeah, I try to do at least four. So that way you can really go like syllable by syllable, because that's the way I revise poetry, is like kind of going sound by sound.
Do you have any poetry handy that you could read for us?
Oh, mercy. Hmm. Yeah, I can pull something up. Let me just jump over. Well, Ed, you'll know your audience better than I will. Is there anything you think they'd be interested in hearing about?
That it's not important. It's what you think.
Okay,
This is
fair enough.
unscripted, and they expect it to be unscripted and therefore full of surprises.
Okay, let's see what I can find then. I have my. I wish I had a big, you know, sheaf of poems, but the nature of doing poetry lately is that you keep them digital. So I have a nice
No apologies.
long. So what do I? Hmm, here I will. This one's a little. This one's a little older. It is a little free verse piece, but I think when I think about, hmm, actually, I was going to pull that one, and I realized it's all marked up for revision, so we're not going to read that one. We're going to read something else. Um, this is the nature of it. When you go back into your own files. Okay, think I think I have something.
Okay.
All right. Yes. So this is called "The Idyll of the Magpies." This was published, a little magazine, maybe 2 years ago. Little poem, little magazine, but it was something I enjoyed doing. I think something that could be unpredictable.
Very good.
Idyll of the Magpies. This is ideal, as in Idyll.
Mhm.
He did not know to mourn his final mate, who sat forever cold on her empty-shelled brood. He twitters to the last and sings to the by and by, the day I bear false eyewitness. Where should I stand for the impossible sight? Where are my heels? How my hands? These answers went extinct before these magpies. No knowing now, no meaning on the wing. Today is sunned for the loss we never see. There, from the far chimney smoke, the last magpie flies. To the sun? To the night? By the failing teal-white wings to rest, to land and take flight no more. Past is the world he plundered as he pleased. No more hair, twine, earth, straw, or vellum to write the sphere of his mate's great nest. He carries no thread to inherit, not an ounce from the text he gathered. I wave hard to startle him to flight, but the last magpie does not seek to exist. He sees the cerulean vista and tawny meadow. He flies for the idyll of life now dead. By the magi stars, he migrates to the oblivion of his kind. I whistle low for his unseen departure. I am his final witness. My memory, like his, a fragile, passing testimony.
That's
There you
that's
go.
good.
Thank you.
I like that.
Thank you.
What was what was the origin of that poem?
Yeah. I was reading. There's a nature writer. I believe his name is Bill Davidson. He was writing about just kind of the extinction of species because he's a bird guy. And he's talking about how when the last of an animal species dies, no one is there to see it. Um, like we never actually see an extinction. We usually experience it after it's already passed. So I imagined, I was like, oh, like what would it be like to see the
Hmm.
last bird, so in this case, the last magpie, what it would be like to experience that bird from afar and to know, oh, there goes a little epoch, there goes a little era. Um, so it's a little mournful, but that's generally how it goes for me in poems. That it gave me an image that was striking and a little sad, but had a lot to sort of make it beautiful. Hopefully, so yeah, thank you. I did not know I was going to be reading that one today, but that was kind of fun. Yeah,
Is it fun reading them out loud?
yes, it is. I think I think that's the measure of a poem. Is if well, it's one of the measures, but a good measure is if you can read them out loud if they sound okay. Because I think, I mean, heck, if any piece of writing should sound good when you read it aloud, but I think particularly poems, because I'm thinking about like a poem as an experience where when you hear it, it needs to be like, oh, like it gives you sort of that transport. It has a sort of transporting effect. Um, I don't know. So you've heard now at this point, Ed, you've heard me read three poems out loud. So what is your experience of hearing any poems out loud? Like, how do you hear them?
I I hear them. I hear them rather than see them. And what I mean by that is I read something that's in a book. It's on a piece of paper. And it's something that goes into the rational part of my brain. I'm 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 looking at it in terms of how the words are put together. I'm looking at it in a rational kind of way, more analytical. It's like, reading a book of philosophy or reading a novel or something like that. But hearing it, it becomes an embodied experience. It's sensory,
Hmm.
and that I think um, that's really important. Uh, it's because what the hearing does is it forces all these other parts of your body to respond to it. Um, because you're not looking at something. The sight of hearing someone's read, the sight is the last thing that matters.
Hmm.
Um, but you're hearing something, and as I was hearing about the magpies flying away, I guess that's part of what's in there. I had that image in my mind, and it made me think about I used to live in Wyoming, in Jackson Hole, Wyoming.
Okay.
And where I lived, there were all these huge crows.
Yeah.
And I loved watching these crows. And I mean, they were huge, about the size of a football. They were not little tiny little blackbirds. These are huge.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
And I loved watching them, and I thought, well, someday I'm gonna open up a bar, I'm gonna in a whiskey bar, and I'm gonna call it the Crowbar, and play on words.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
it'd be a picture of a crow with a crowbar in his talons. Um, but that you see that um hearing that story or hearing those words, hearing the what you're trying to communicate, I heard it in a totally different way than if I was reading it.
definitely, definitely. Yeah, I mean, usually, yeah, I mean, I think you're fully correct. Like it's embodied, and I think it helps the transporting experience. So usually, when sometimes I keep a newsletter, a Substack newsletter, and um, I'll publish when I publish poems there of my own or of others. I make sure that they're audio first. Technically, I think they're formatted as podcast episodes, are only a minute or 2 minutes long. But that way, when you go to read the poem, you actually, before you see the words, you have the option to hear it first.
Yeah.
Because I think there is something very particular about hearing a poem aloud that, like you're saying, like it does move the mind more than reading on a screen. And I think that's it's pretty valuable. It's really, really valuable. I think that's also why Once Upon a Time, every occasion had a poem. Every occasion, wedding, uh, funeral,
Huh.
birth, anniversary, many of them would come. And sometimes they were poems written for the occasion, but other times they'd just be someone in the party who knew, like, oh, here's a good poem for these things. Like this, I know that sometimes they'll still do them for presidential inaugurations, which is kind of left over from that. But it used to be more widespread, I think.
And they'd be the poet laureate of the United States, and he would or she would write a poem for the occasion,
Yep.
and,
Yep.
and
Yeah, like Robert Frost did that for JFK. So we're talking earlier about memorization. So here's something for you. The Robert Frost, I forget the original poem that he had planned to read at JFK's inauguration in 1960, or maybe 1961. And he had selected one, he printed it out, and he was up there on the podium. And he decided at the last minute, I think he decided at the last minute he didn't like it. He didn't like the poem for the occasion anymore. And so he just recited one of his own from memory instead. Again, I wish I had the titles of these poems that I had memorized, kind of ready to hand to be like, oh, like he dropped this one in order to read this one. But it just goes to speak not only to Robert Frost as a poet, but also as a performer, which as the American poet reading at an inauguration, that's a big part of it, is being that sort of performer.
he's reading the crowd,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
he's having an embodied experience with the people that are there. I've been in that position where
Mhm.
I've I've gone to give a speech, and after meeting the first person in the room, I realized I've got the wrong speech for this this group, so I had to change it, and I had to create one on the spot.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's the first time I've ever experienced 3, 4 weeks later, people saying, "I really liked what you had to say." You know,
Interesting.
yeah. I mean, it was like, wow. What happened here? You know, so the sensory connection to poetry matters, and so do you wander around the house reading your poetry to hear yourself in different, spaces? Is that something that poets do? Is that?
Maybe I don't. That's because I can't go very far in our house without bumping into someone or tripping over the dog or our son. So I usually have to do that sitting down. I'll just close the door, and then through the door you can hear me talking to myself, basically. Um, just because hearing it in a room, maybe hearing it in different rooms, like taking it into a bathroom so you hear like the tiles echo or something. But normally I just do it at my desk, and it's more about the way it like sounds from my mouth, like the difference between, like, okay, like here I can look at it a billion times, and I do during the revision process, but hearing it just gives you a different sense of the poem, like a different bodily engagement with it. Yeah. So if it were up to me, I would spend all day long walking around reading poems aloud to understand how they work. But
I think that sounds like a marvelous thing to do.
yeah,
Um, Let me ask you one more question.
yeah,
The event that we met at was an event at a seminary at Gordon Conwell Seminary in Charlotte. Um, I'm assuming that you're a person of faith. Is that correct?
yeah, yeah. Yep.
And how does being a person of faith factor into your writing of poetry? What does that connection look like?
This is the $1 million question. Um, I think it is very multifaceted. That's the nice thing about it. Is the longer that I think about it, the more ways I can connect what I get to do writing poems with, um, faith in God, faith in Christ. I think the easiest one to get into is to think on creation. So Genesis 1, um, you know, the Lord speaks the world into existence. That's the Christian uh, that's the Christian kind of Genesis account. And so, obviously, I'm amazed at the scientific understanding of the way the world functions, which is great glory to the Lord as well. But I can't get away from the image of God as the first poet,
Mm.
because the words he spoke, the words he enacted, they were the ones that put light into the world. So that's one thing. Which then the implication being that when I'm out here scrawling away with first my pen and then my pencils, I'm getting to imitate the first creator. Um, and I think that is a great honor. I think that is also a great responsibility in some ways, because it means, though, this is not something frivolous. This is not something silly. This is not something necessarily to be taken too lightly. I think it's good to have fun with it. But it also helps to understand that, if it is possible to write a beautiful poem because God has put beauty into the world. And so that means that I better I better try to do that. I better really be careful to seek that. As a I mean, maybe as a steward, certainly as an imitator. Um, and then also it gets into removing a lot of pressure, because I know I'm not going to invent a new wheel, because if I'm only imitating God, how far can I really go? So remove some of that pressure, but also adds a certain level of care, I think.
It sounds like there's a poem that needs to be written about that.
Many poems, and I think I I would need to spend a long time on them, because my knee jerk reaction is that you could never write a poem as good as the idea actually is. Just because it is such a beautiful idea. Although I have written essays on it, and again, because it's sort of a bottomless well. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I like that though. That would be a good poem.
Where does where do where do you publish your poetry?
Here and there. So I've been published in a place called the Clay Jar Review. I've been published in the Blotter magazine, so small magazines. And then here and there, I'll publish poetry at my Substack, which is called the Stylist Submits. So it's kevinlatore.substack.com. There's your plug. Um, I'll publish poetry here and there. Though those are kind of the audio style poems that I mentioned. And then I'll also publish poets that I know there. I know that we do kind of a liturgical setup where we'll have an Advent poem series, original poetry, and then we'll have a Holy Week series of original poetry, which will be coming up later, not this month, but next, and going into Easter. So that is, yeah, where you can find most of my poems, but then also kind of small magazines that I hear of and that I get to be published in when I have the chance to submit.
That's fantastic. Well, I've
Yeah,
enjoyed getting to know you and
yeah,
very much enjoyed hearing your poetry today.
thank you.
And I wish you well. I wish you I don't know if you want to I don't know if you wish success to a poet because that might ruin the poet. But I wish you would get whatever you want from
Hmm.
the um, the the craft of poet of being a poet.
Thank you. I hope I hope that comes true. I also hope that I get what it is, whatever it is that I need. 'Cause I'm not sure what that is yet.
Well,
And
I
thank
think
you.
that's a good place to start on a lot of this stuff is not knowing, so that the whole process is one of discovery.
It's always discovery, and that's that's not just poets. I don't need to tell you that. I mean, I know you're discovering things. I know everyone listening to this is discovering something in some aspect of their life. It's one of the chief joys.
Well, after listening to you today, I've decided I'm going to create a playlist on my podcast for poets. So I think it's time now to have
Yay.
a poets playlist on my Eddie Network podcast, and
Okay.
all my poet friends will love that. And so I think there are maybe five of you guys, women.
Okay.
So I think I have to go back and look through it. I mean, it's been over 200 episodes, so there's a lot of words that have flew through the airways. But um, I appreciate you being here, and let's talk some more because I'd like to see how we could maybe do something like what we did in Charlotte here in Winston-Salem. I think there would be a lot of people that would be interested in something like that. So, so
Yeah. No, I would love to stay in touch about that. Definitely.
right. Well, thank you, Kevin, and thank you all for watching. Please hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe. And if you have a comment that or you want to say something, or you even have a poem that you would like to offer, do so. Uh, we appreciate all the interaction that comes through this medium of interaction with people. So thank you very much. And we'll see you next time here on the Eddie Network podcast. Bye bye.
Thank you. Thank you.